If you guys watched my first video, you will have seen some unloved and unpainted models that were left over in my shed before I converted it into what it is now. I think it's about time I got some paint on those minis. I'm Benji and welcome to Benji's Hobbies. Age of Sigmar has been a game that I have been long interested in. I love the aesthetic and the lore that Games Workshop have created, so when the Soul Wars box was released, I was keen to get my hands on the good half and get to grips with the rules. Unfortunately, as it always does, life and other projects got in the way, and for a good long while they've been left unbuilt, unpainted, and unloved. It wasn't until during lockdown that they saw the light of day again. I don't know about you guys, but I love assembling models. I find that there's something really therapeutic about clipping models off sprues, gluing them together, and especially in times of stress or low hobby motivation, they can be a great little distraction. I'm really keen to try out Age of Sigmar, and hopefully when the world gets back to some sort of normality again, I'll be able to visit my local gaming centre again and get some demo games in. But to make sure I'm off to a flying start, I'll need to get my army painted. I could of course play with unpainted minis, but as you'll know if you watched my last video, I really only like playing with painted minis, so I'm going to give myself the challenge of getting these guys done. Unfortunately, when I looked over the minis that I'd previously assembled, I noticed a few mould lines that I'd either missed or been too lazy to remove, and due to some careless handling during the shed move, some of the minis had become damaged. I set to work cleaning off the mould lines, making the necessary repairs and gluing them to the bases before I decided on my paint scheme. I took some time looking up different paint schemes, both in the rulebook and on the internet. When I'm deciding on a paint scheme, I always weigh up the balance between how good the paint scheme will look and how long it's going to take me to get them painted. If I have to paint a lot of minis, or I want an easy and quick way of completing an army, I'll tend to keep the scheme as simple as possible. Whilst doing some research, I really grew to like the living statue idea, that these warriors were somehow magically animated to fight for some sort of sorcerer or other unknown power. I know this doesn't really necessarily fit with the lore, but hell, they're my minis, and I'm telling my story with them. Not only do they look pretty good, it should be really quick for me to paint an entire army of them, and repeat the process when I inevitably add more to it at a later date. There are some really cool statuesque paint schemes and guides out there if you start looking, and I was particularly inspired by Midwinter Mini's Sandstone Necrons, but I wanted to make sure that these were my own, so rather than directly copying, I decided to come up with my own idea. I recently tried out the new Rune Lord brass paint for the first time, and when I used it, I really liked the colour. The coverage was really good, and I was keen to try it out some more to see what else I could use it for, and this project felt like a good time to put it through its paces. I picked up a can of Rune Lord brass spray, along with a nifty Citadel spray stick, and set to work undercoating the models. As I had expected, the coverage from the can was really good, and I must admit I'm really impressed with the spray stick as well. My trusty blue tack on a stick has worked for me, but after dropping a couple of models on the floor whilst undercoating recently, I've started to lose faith in it. I did consider painting the army in smaller batches, but as it was going to be a super simple paint scheme, I decided to paint the whole lot as one big batch. Your mileage with this may vary somewhat, but for now at least, it's working for me. With the whole lot undercoated using the spray can, I went and did some touch-ups on missed bits in the deeper recesses with the brush before moving on to the next step. Next, I wanted to add some depth to the models, and to do this I applied a liberal wash of Agrax Earthshade. It's very easy to just slap this on and hope it will flow into the recesses, but there are quite a few flat areas on these miniatures, and I didn't want to leave the tea-stained effect that you sometimes see on models, where a really heavy wash has been applied. I used the brush to help move and guide the wash around from the flatter panels and into the recessed areas. If you apply too much wash, you can simply soak it up with the brush, or use a wet brush to slightly dilute it to help it run easier. I find that the Citadel shade brushes are particularly good for this. Before you move on to the next step, it's important to make sure that the wash is completely dry. Once the models were dry, I returned back to my Rune Lord brass, and this time applied a heavy dry brush all over the models. The details on these models are really raised and pronounced, so it makes dry brushing really easy. It's at this point that I'm really glad I spent a bit more time removing mould lines as well, as these would have really caught the paint and stuck out like a sore thumb with the dry brushing. If you're watching this video, I'm assuming you already have some knowledge of basic painting techniques, so I won't get into too much detail on dry brushing, but essentially it's removing the majority of paint from your brush onto some kitchen roll or cardboard before running the brush over the model. This leaves a very light dusting of paint on the most prominent or raised edges. Dry brushing is best done with either a specific dry brushing brush or with an older brush that you don't mind ruining, as it does tend to take its toll on the bristles. In this case, I'm using a large Citadel dry brush. You'll also notice I'm using a dry brushing pad from Artis Opus. While you can certainly use kitchen roll or some cardboard, I find that I have far more control over how much paint is left on the brush when I use the dry brushing pad. I guess this comes down to personal preference and what works for you personally. Whilst I'm applying a fairly heavy dry brush, the effect is very subtle, but it does help create a greater contrast between the darker recesses and the more raised edges. The next step is to apply a much lighter dry brush of Canoptec Alloy. This is another newish metallic paint in the Citadel range, and it's the accompanying layer paint for Runelord Brass. It's important not to clean or wet your brush between the two colours unless you're going to allow the brush to completely dry. Whilst dry brushing with a damp brush has its place, it can leave a different effect than what we're trying to achieve, and may inadvertently dilute the paint more than you want it to. To be on the safe side, either let the brush completely dry out after you've cleaned it, or simply move on to the next colour. Using the same brush as before, I use the pad to remove more paint this time and focus my brush strokes on either the highest points of the model to simulate light coming down from above, and on the most prominent raised edges of the model. Unlike iron, brass doesn't rust, but over time will gradually corrode and tarnish to form a verdigris patina. Thankfully, Games Workshop have created a paint specifically for this purpose, Nihilak Oxide. This isn't a paint I have a huge amount of experience with. I've used it on small metallic areas previously, but I've not used it over large areas of a model, so this is a great opportunity to try it out and see what it can really do. Best way to use this paint is to apply it to the areas of the model that you want to colour, and then wipe away the excess using some kitchen towel, leaving the greenish colour in the recesses. Now at this stage, all the models are looking very similar, so I want to try and use this next stage to add a bit of subtle variation and differentiate the troops slightly. Perhaps the older or more elite warriors have been fighting for longer, so their armour has corroded more than the fresher troops. Or perhaps the leaders of the army have better kept or protected armour. Or maybe their armour is protected by spells or enchantments that protect them from the elements. Either way, even with a single paint, you can definitely add some character to models and can really help tell the model's story. On some models, I applied Nihilak Oxide just the most recessed areas of the model to create a more subtle effect, whilst on others, I literally coated the entire model with it before wiping away the excess. On some, I tried to keep it just on the armour, and on others, I just painted it on the cloth. There are so many variations to try, so I tried a little bit on each different model. Whilst I think overall the effect looked really good, I think I may have gone a little bit overboard on some of the models, so I toned it back slightly by dry brushing again with a small amount of Runelord Brass and Canoptec Alloy. I mean, that's the joy of experimenting with new paints. You can try things out, see if it works. If it doesn't, I'm sure there is a fix somewhere along the line. I wanted my leaders to stand out from the rest of the rabble, so I decided to try painting glowing blue eyes and apply some object source lighting. I used a small dry brush to apply a dark blue around the face and around the shoulders of the Lord Arcanum, followed by a lighter blue in a smaller radius, and finally up to a white. I then applied a very thin rim of pure white around the eye sockets. Whilst I think this effect might have looked okay on other miniatures, with so much of the rest of the model being a blue-green colour, it really doesn't stand out as much as I would have liked. It doesn't look bad, but it just doesn't really give me the effect that I'm after. I think this is definitely something I'll be revisiting in the future, perhaps with an airbrush, but that's definitely one for another time. With the army painted, it's time to base them. So at this point, I want to say a big thank you and give Damien O'Byrne a shout out. Not only is Damien my latest generous patron, but he also gave me this awesome idea of using milk bottle tops to mount the bases to, using a small strip of double-sided tape, which makes it much easier to paint the base rims without getting paint all over my hands or touching the model. I decided to paint the rims with Steel Legion Drab before using a generous layer of Geek Gaming fast drying basing glue and one of the base ready mixes. Whilst I like the effect and the simplicity of the paint and the basing scheme for this army so far, I've had a bit of a brainwave and have an idea in my head of how I'd like to see this army based. You might want to click that subscribe button, as you don't want to miss out on the next video where I'll show you what I have in mind. I finished painting the army and have it table ready in a record time. It might not be the most adventurous paint scheme and it may not be the most skillfully painted, but at least it's painted and they're ready to be played with. Now all I need is this lockdown to end and I'll be able to get these Stormcast on the table to protect the mortal realms. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I've really enjoyed painting up this Stormcast army over the last week or so, and it's really nice to have another bunch of models out of my pile of joy and painted and ready for the table. The scheme I've gone with is absolutely 100% super simple, but the reason I went for that scheme is A, I wanted it ready really quickly, and B, if I decide to add to it in the future, I'll be able to get them table ready in no time, and it's going to be something that's really easy to replicate. Make sure you click that subscribe button because I have a really cool idea in mind of how I want to base this army, and I really want to share that with you guys. If you want to support me at all, make sure you're going and checking out the links in the description below. There is a link to my Element Games affiliate account, so if you're going to be buying any toys from them, make sure you're clicking that link, and I get a little kickback from Element Games. It all helps support the channel and fund what I am doing in my shed. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, take care.